If the one divine consciousness is one indivisible, which is all, if it is one and it is indivisible, how can it ever represent itself? How can it ever manifest in this innumerable richness and diversity? Because it cannot be divided, remember? It's a miracle that the world can exist the way it exists, coming from something which is indivisibly one, isn't it? Would you agree it's a miracle? How does the one then execute that miracle to divide itself, or at least give an appearance of having divided itself? Try to imagine a consciousness which is indivisibly one. How can it ever create that? It cannot. Unless, and this is the process that it uses, and this is the brilliance of the understanding, it never ever divides itself. It goes through 5 stages of self-modification, so to say, which lead eventually to the appearance of divided forms. And those 5 stages of self-modification are what are called the 5 elemental states. And they're elemental because they're so essential. Without them, there could not be anything in a becoming from the being. So I will describe them in these ways. Let's conceive of, and because we have to necessarily bring it down to a level tangible enough to our mental conception, conceive of the first state of the one consciousness, indivisible. The divine knows itself utterly, and there is nothing else other than itself, its own consciousness, which is existing and blissfully. There is none other. There is no multiplicity. There is only that. Dwelling in it, it can dwell upon all the things that it could be. And it can dwell in its blissfulness on all that it can ever be, but held in unmanifest state. It dwells in itself like a writer broods on the beautiful novel that she might express. Dwell on all possibilities. At that moment, nothing is particularly articulated. Everything is possible. I'm free to do anything, be anything. And then as it dwells on that, it can dwell on some more than others. Oh, it could be a romantic novel, it could be an adventure novel, or it could be a blend of these two, or it could be completely a detective novel. All possibilities. And then it dwells on one aspect or other. Perhaps this, perhaps that, or moving from this into that. And you see, there is a possibility, without ever splitting or dividing, of dwelling on one and then on another and moving between them, which we may describe at an essential level as the consciousness concentrating, compressing, or diffusing and expanding. And the characteristic of this first poise of consciousness, we will call it the etheric, is expansion, contraction. Expansion, contraction, and rhythming out, as if creating in consciousness the sense of ripples or waves. But waves, there is nothing other. There is only a movement of consciousness dwelling in itself. So, still no form. But then something interesting happens. Because there is no time nor space so far, all possible ways of rippling, rhythming are simultaneously present. And it can dwell on one particular rhythming and another particular rhythming, and the rhythmings can then blend or touch, interact with each other. One ripple blends or touches another. And this becomes the second elemental state that we call air. And I'll explain to you why it is called air as we go along, because Sri Aurobindo describes this. And you will see the profundity of the ancient insight and the knowledge. So here in this air principle, what happens is rhythms of expansion, contraction meet rhythms of expansion and contraction. And as they meet, they form resonances. And you've probably seen this in physics. When two waves combine, they create troughs and peaks. There is an interference pattern, we say, in physics. But the interference pattern itself is appearing and disappearing, joining, separating. And remember, it's not just two waves, an infinity of richness of waves playing together, creating all kinds of interference patterns that appear and disappear. But the characteristic of these joining of waves is they collide, or they experience pressure against each other. And I'll give you this as an example, again, reducing to a material level. If you have a pulsating, let's say, drum, okay, a drum shaking at a frequency, just for arbitrarily say 100 times per second. I bring another drum which is vibrating at 105 times per second. The waves will pass each other. But difference between the two of 5 pulses per second, you will hear as a sound, as the combination. Okay. Now, as this frequency is brought to 100, that will become slower until it joins. And now as if the two sounds join. And the moment they join, here's the interesting part. If you pull one drum away, the blend of these two waves joining will pull the other drum. It literally transfers pressure from one side to the other. You push this drum, it will push the other. They are as if locked into each other. They are as if touching, holding each other. Although nothing was ever moved, there is no force to hold, and yet it's holding, joining as if becoming one. Pressure, touch becomes the characteristic of the air principle. By the play of combinations of vibrations dwelling on itself, pressure is created. Touch becomes the basis. And why do we call this the air principle? Sri Aurobindo explains, because of all things that exist in the universe at a human experiential level, air has the characteristic closest to this principle. Because air flows and touches you, but you cannot see it. You cannot smell it. You cannot hold it. You cannot grasp it. It has no solidity. It has no existence other than the sensation of the touch that you feel, isn't it? You blow the air, you feel the touch. That's it. You never saw anything. And associated is to the ether principle is the sound characteristic because of the resonance, the vibration of the play, the waves. That's the characteristic of sound. You hear the vibration, but there is no touch even. So from pure sound, where you hear, there is something, to the touch, which is the air principle, we move now to the next degree of self-modification. The same consciousness, remember, is playing this game through layers, so to say. Now, when you have two kinds of touch, or many kinds of touch combining, and the touch itself joining together, what do you find? The appearance of form. A form seen, perceived in various ways, but in itself insubstantial. Your hand could pass right through it, and yet there is the vividness of a form. That is the characteristic of the third self-modification. It exists, it has a form, it has distinctiveness, multidimensionality, but it can pass, it can appear, it could disappear. It is unstable, it is semi-transparent perhaps, or to the touch, your hand could pass through it to a rigid hand. And therefore, on the material world, the closest equivalent experience that we have of such a thing is in fire. When fire burns, what do you see? You see a distinctive form. You can pass your hand right through it, isn't it? And yet it is there. It is as if luminous. And there is, of course, a deeper aspect to it. The physical fire becomes the representation of it, but Agni is also, at this level, the primary operating principle in the Vedic symbolism. Agni is the force of the will which is the creator of forms. And there are 3 modes of operation of Agni, which is if you had to translate in the physical terms, 3 fires. The chemical fire, there is the electric fire, and the atomic fire. In all 3, we'll see the common operation of Agni. What happens in a chemical fire? Molecules combine and join to create new materials. The fire burns. Well, what do we say? Oxygen combines with hydrogen and creates water. Or something else combines with something, creates something else. That's the chemical fire. There is the electric fire, where it is not molecules joining, it is atoms joining by sharing their electrons on the periphery. And it is this electric fire which is the basis for so many kinds of phenomena, including the lightning and such other. It is also the basis by which molecules are formed, which becomes the basis for molecular fires. Go still deeper. You go into subatomic fire, interactions inside the atom which create the atom, and therefore it's called the solar fire in the Veda. So you have the solar fire, electric fire, and the chemical fire, the 3 Agnis, so to say. But you see how A deep truth can be observed in its operation in nature and yet held at its more essential level. Within us is the one Agni, the intensity of the will concentrated, turning to a purpose and unfolding, driving, creating forms. The forms are still unstable though. They appear, we see them. Even in a vision, we can vision them. And even that is working of Agni. But now we want to concretize, stabilize. So from the third principle, the 5 elements, we move to one more degree of self-modification. And here Sri Aurobindo describes this as the principle by which, let's say, 2 forms enter into a relationship by which they stick to each other. And the stickiness of the forms makes for the possibility of the forms now to exist in large combinations, but because they're sticky and not rigid, they can flow. And so this density which is felt, a kind of a stability, not yet stable in the form itself, but a stability in the substantiality of moving forms. And the closest equivalent experience we have in the physical world is of water flowing. So you watch a river flowing. You've all seen this. If you were in last year's Shakti Kumbh at Rishikesh, you would have seen as the Ganga flows, suddenly there is a rise and the water flows. But all the water that comes after also rises on the same spot and flows on. And all the rest that comes rises on the same spot and flows. The water is constantly changing. And yet there is the stability of some kind of a form, some kind of a wave shape. And if you try to understand why is it rising only in this part and not elsewhere, look inside the water. Inside is a stone. And the flow of the water somehow hitting the stone is as if pushed up and creates this rising wave and the water flows on. But the rising bump, the hump of the water is as if semi-permanent, representing an underlying potential now manifest in the flow of the water. You can get a sense of what this represents. Or you look at the sea waves. While you're here, go to the beach, watch the waves. And you'll find one after another the waves coming. Each one is different, but keep on staring. And in a short while you'll realize they're all unique, they're all distinctive, and yet it is the same rhythm that repeats itself. The rhythm of the ocean that keeps wave after wave, isn't it? So here you find the sense of a first appearance of what might become stable rigidity, but rather it is stable fluidity at this moment. And then comes the 5th modifier of consciousness, where now within the consciousness, what was this fluidity? There is the infusion or the emergence of rigidness of combination. And then for the first time, you have an object which is hard. You can hit it. And it has a wave. The sound is a wave. It has a certain plasticity. It resonates, creates, in the point where it hits, there's perhaps a spark. There is the sound and there is the touch. All the 5 elements are felt. But the 5th element is the most strong, making for its rigidity. If at this point, by an application of the fire principle, you heat this metal, you will find the fire principle increasing in its content has affected the rigidity principle, and now I could simply bend it. Heated to 500 degrees perhaps, I could simply bend this and it would be malleable, almost like water, but not quite. And it's the fire principle which did it. The touch at that point would have a different character, not this hard touch, but a softer touch. At that point with another piece of metal, because my hand would probably burn, I can push this and shape it by the pressure of touch. And the ring of it, the sound of it would be quite different. So what we recognize is in any object, any form, any substance, you have all 5 elemental principles operative, but the particular combination of how these 5 are gathered in them makes for the distinctive quality that it expresses. And this, now you see, is the means by which the one indivisible consciousness, modifying itself in its relation with itself, nothing ever happens which is other than it, simply dwelling on itself, in layers phenomenally in a sequence of self-modification. By the fifth stage becomes an appearance of rigid, distinct, separate forms. What an amazing miracle. And the five elemental states or the elemental operations of consciousness are the means by which it accomplishes this miracle. The entire world, therefore, is as if formed of the same one consciousness undergoing five kinds of self-modification, and the combination of those five makes for this characteristics of the substance. So this becomes the basis for an entire science, you might say.